You're listening to the Deerfield Public Library podcast, February 24th, 2020.
What lingers is a kind of desire to be sensuous, to be intimate. I mean, that's what I crave. And it's what more and more I crave from poetry.
Welcome to the Deerfield Public Library podcast, where we interview authors, artists, and other notable people from Chicagoland and around the world. I'm your host, Dylan Zavagno, Adult Services Coordinator at the library. I'm thrilled to present this conversation with the poet Richie Hofmann about his beautiful new collection, 100 Lovers, published earlier this month by Knopf. Richie Hofmann is also the author of the collection Second Empire. He teaches at Stanford University and lives in Chicago and San Francisco. I am so thrilled to talk about 100 Lovers by Richie Hofmann, a book I've been anticipating for well over a year, especially as some of these poems began to appear in the New Yorker, New York Review of Books, The Nation, Yale Review, and this very library and podcast. Richie shared Male Beauty on our Queer Poem a Day series. Richie was also discussed in our episode with the poet Rachel Menes about her book, The Naomi Letters, with the poet Lisa Heighton, my co-director on Queer Poem a Day, about her book After Feast. So, Richie, you've been haunting this podcast for a long time, and you live at least part-time in Chicago and have become a friend. And I have to say, this is a new favorite book. So how does it feel to have the book in the world, possessed by all of these readers? And it's such a beautiful book. I sort of imagine the speaker of the poems would love to put out a beautiful art object in the world.
That's right, Dylan. Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to get to speak with you. The book is out now, and it hasn't quite sunk in that it's out. Everyone wants to celebrate the publication of a new book, but there's also a way that it feels kind of funerary for me as well, because it's not mine anymore. And you spend so much time with this book, you spend time working on it. It's mostly private. You're right to say that it does kind of leak out in the way we publish poems. But now it's in the world and it belongs to readers.
So, Richie, one of the first things that you said to me, we were talking about poetry, and I said, I always found it difficult myself to write descriptions. And I just go to abstract language. And you said, oh no, I have the opposite problem. I could write lists of descriptions for days. And I had a teacher say to me once, your eyes are whores, and that it totally changed your writing. And that actually appears in a poem in your first book, Second Empire. I was wondering if you might read that poem description and talk about what that change was in your writing.
I'd be happy to. Description. Where you were, everything was becoming ice. The paved courtyard, the windows looking out onto it. You traveled back and forth between buildings on a bus, passing trees and umbrellas inverted in the wind. You moved back and forth. I was elsewhere, in a small studio, painted white so many times the walls were thick with it. Once a poet told me, your eyes are whores. Once description was all I thought I needed to bridge things. And snow shawled the branches. And you took the keys from your pocket. And snow feathered the grass, which was mine to remember and forget. Well, this recounts in It's a Chicago poem, actually. I'm realizing as I mean, you know, moving between buildings on a bus in this terrible weather, and the studio painted white so many times. It's a poem about being in Chicago and being in Baltimore, being apart. Um, and it recounts also this educational experience when I was in a workshop with the poet Henri Cole at the New York State Summer Writers Institute in the summer of 2011, now more than 10 years ago. And, I was somewhat new to writing poems, and I would bring in my drafts, and Henri was marvelously insightful and eminently quotable. Those of us who were in that workshop still can remember kind of verbatim some of his pronouncements on our poems. They were so funny. And I brought in one poem. I don't remember what it was. And Henri Cole said, "Your eyes are whores. They want to describe everything they see. But description is an element of poetry. It is not poetry." And, I was quite speechless, but it changed my writing life in some ways. I thought finally I needed to do something more. And Henri Cole is a favorite poet of mine. I would absolutely listen to what he suggested. Um, and the poem kind of formulated around that moment. I can't remember when I wrote this poem, but that idea stuck with me. It was such a memorable phrase. Your eyes are whores. Of course, it also it corresponded to my poetry's interest in sexuality and desire, but was also a kind of moment when I thought I needed to do more. I needed to put more of myself into the poems. That's been the challenge from the beginning, how to put more of the life, more of a personality, more of a psychology into the poems. And there's several moments in my education um, where I had these kinds of crises. One was Henri Cole's "Your Eyes Are Whores." Another was in a workshop with the poet Rachel Haddis, who asked me, "Where are you amidst all of this cultural furniture?" And I remember thinking, oh, well, why would I want to be in the poem? That hadn't really occurred to me. And so I feel as I've tried to become a sharper poet, a richer poet, a poet of more force and originality over the last decade, it's been a project too of moving beyond description, moving beyond cultural exegesis or ekphrasis into something that feels more direct and more personal.
Oh my gosh, amazing! I mean, it seems like it moves those descriptive details in that poem into the realm of what are their import for me? Do I remember them or not? And it's my choice. And then, of course, in this new book, 100 Lovers, you call your heart the heart of a cheating whore. So this book is sort of an erotic diary, almost a travel log through Europe, various encounters, a relationship, a marriage, and I think it expresses how a lot of gay men of our generation live. It seemed, I guess the way I thought about it was that you heard your eyes are whores, and part of you thought, well, the problem with that is not whore. The problem is the eyes. So I'm going to include every other sense, which includes a sense of memory and history and self and smell. So I thought I would ask you to start reading from the new book. How about German cities?
Yes, certainly. I love your mind, Dylan.
Well,
It's
I love this
interesting.
book.
It's interesting when you're writing a book of poems, you're really working poem by poem. And it's not until later that something suggests itself of the broader shape. So it's interesting to kind of consider it as a book because it's not something, at least was doing when I wrote it.
Yeah, yeah.
This poem, German Cities, um, well, it's about, in some sense, falling in love with a singer, a bass. German cities. Next week, he will be away auditioning. Stuttgart, Frankfurt, Hamburg, Berlin. We talk about music, style, discipline, the great composers. He sings and speaks with the voice of a priest, father, or devil. I pull on my jeans. In my pocket, the department store's strip of paper sprayed with cologne. The garden that enters the room is the garden of a childhood in Munich. The naked old men who smoked along the banks of the river are dead now. My pocket smells of masculine lavender.
This is just astonishing. And I'm trying to figure out, how does a poem like this work, right? So it's 14 lines. There's a sonnet suggestion, but if we're going to have a turn at the end of the sonnet here, it's a turn towards a detail like that, towards memory and towards smell. Am I onto something there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm reading it now and thinking about this poem as a sonnet. Um, I it I think it turns a couple of times. I felt it as I read it. I pull on my jeans. I mean, that's one. I mean, that's a turn that could kind of occur in any poem. Um, it's kind of a flash forward past some kind of encounter, and then the smell of that cologne. You know, these strips of paper they hand out in the department store as a sample. You know, I remember when I wanted to write about this experience, that was a struggle. Like, how do you call that thing? That, you know, perfume sample or something in a way that's like efficient. Like, if there's a technical name for such a thing, I don't know it, and if I don't know it, probably most readers don't know it. Um, so I settled on department store strip of paper sprayed with cologne. I think I liked that, you know, the spray was in there, that it had a little verbal activity. And then a turn again happens when the smell of that cologne evokes the speaker's childhood, um, in Germany. And I thought too, after I wrote this poem, that Cologne is a German city too. You know, it's not really evoked here, but there's such a list of cities in here. And one of the sensuous memories I have of that childhood are these nudist spaces in Garmisch, and the kind of effortless nudity of these old men who would smoke cigars and kind of walk around, and bodies are, you know, really interesting to children. To me, seeing naked old men was a really kind of interesting experience, kind of scary, kind of, you know, out of sorts. And as I kind of remembered them, I thought too that they must all be dead. I mean, if they were old when I was a child, they're gone. Um,
Well,
and
Richie, as you're saying this, I have to interrupt you. I'm realizing this is connected to the Shakespearean sonnet and the Young Man series, and, you know, cautioning the young man, you know, you're going to grow old one day, so you better seize this opportunity now.
that's right. And smell is not seizable, is it? I mean, it's maybe the most involuntary of the senses in a way, right? It's hard to like close off the nose to the experience of smell. I mean, you could maybe cover your ears or close your eyes or choose not to touch something, but smell kind of invades the senses. And I think not just this poem, but I think all my poems tend to be interested in what's fleeting, what might be lost, what is in tension because it ages, it disappears, it fades. The speaker's always trying to capture some experience and make it permanent.
Yeah, all of these details. I mean, there's several poems after that end with like a very specific detail, the black anorak or the lace coverlet, or there's a poem with the cheap roses that just sort of end the poem. And the speaker has so many associations. They're so pregnant with meaning, but we're sort of left as readers to piece those together. And I know you've talked to me too about the promiscuity of poetry, and I was wondering if that sort of multiple meaning, those imprecise associations for the reader, if that's part of kind of the seduction or promiscuity of these poems.
Well, it certainly appeals to me as an art form um, because what's sensuous gets to be in the foreground. And when you're thinking about a collection, my visual arts metaphor is usually sculpture, right? I'm thinking about, there's this like block of marble that is the draft or the unwritten poem, and you're kind of carving away pieces. This happens to me on a draft level and on a book level when I'm thinking, I wrote 90 pages and then we whittle it down to 40 to make something meaningful and beautiful. But I've also been thinking, it's also collage, right? That there's a kind of, this is part of the promiscuity, is that the theory of the poetry collection, anyway, as I kind of experience it, is that the power of poems accrues by being placed side by side, right? I'm not writing the book that way. They're complete pieces in and of themselves, ideally, at least in some sense. And then they're put side by side. And the idea is that they accrue in meaning. It's not something I, as the poet, am always conscious of. The poems suggest connections with one another that I wouldn't have been aware of when I write them. And that also to me feels a bit promiscuous. It's always a kind of experience of surprise because you don't know what you're doing when you're making a poetry collection. I mean, you can't know. You're working piece by piece. And I, at least, don't have a sense of the grand design.
It's just amazing. There's another way to. I thought about this too, which was sometimes having language that seems so precise but imprecise at the same time. So one of my favorite lines, and it's one of the few similes in the book. It's from Historic District, is light enters the room like a feeling violating a man. And I almost understand what that means. Maybe we'll hear that poem.
Oh yeah, and I mean, there are purposefully no similes in the book. Really, they're very rare, and it's because in my first book that was a primary strategy. In Second Empire, and you realize this as you put the book together, that so many poems are ending in a simile. That seems to be a strategy I had settled on to create meaning at the very end of poems, typically. And so when I began writing the poems that ended up becoming this book, I was very deliberate in trying to eschew strategies of figuration that I had relied on. I mean, there still are similes, but they're much sparer than in the past. Historic district. With purpose, you pull up the blinds. Light enters the room like a feeling violating a man. Sitting up in a bed built for a husband and a wife, I think for a second, nature has taken us back, leaves scalloping the plaster walls. the ceiling.
Like a lot of these poems, the speaker is sort of haunting a European room of the past, and there's all these details of the old world. But, again, I'm trying to make sense of that. Light enters a room, and I'm thinking, well, it's almost as if the room itself is shocked that there's a gay couple, or the speaker is shocked that there's intimacy in this place.
Yes. Well, and I wonder too if the violation of the light speaks to the violation of this relationship, right? It's a traditional space. There's the bed for the traditional marriage. I think there's all kinds of violations happening, things entering where they don't belong, and everything kind of generalized too. It's a historic district, but we don't know the history. We don't know the precise place. The feeling, whatever feeling it is unspecific and violates an unspecific man. I think in a way it's a poem for me about being an individual, in a kind of generalized space, um, navigating what it means to have a body, what it means to be in a couple, what it means to be in a history, what it means to be in a room, which is itself a kind of simulation of nature, through those scalloped leaves, and what it would mean to have it all taken away. Um, yeah, shock. I like your word shock. It's a poem of shock. It's daytime too, right? The night is over, presumably. Whatever transpired here is over.
Oh, well, that leads me to my next question, which is something else that you told me once, that the sort of arts that attracted you, whether that was classical music or visual art, wasn't from your parents taking you to the opera or museums, but was really something you found on your own. And so many of these poems kind of reference that history of European art from hundreds of years ago. I'm going to quote from the beginning of your essay, My Ekphrasis, which was published last year for the blog of the art gallery Nicholas Hall. Just the first couple paragraphs here. My poems explore sexuality, desire, history, and art. Many of my poems are ekphrastic, responding to works of art, or at least inspired by works of art and the worlds of feeling they evoke. I am drawn to visual arts in my poetry because I'm drawn to visual arts in my life, especially art from antiquity and paintings and sculpture from 17th and 18th century Europe, which I've loved since my childhood years in Munich. In those days, I dreamed of living in the time of Mozart. I thought history was an ornate room I could be myself in. And this was so fascinating to me reading A Hundred Lovers, because the poems in A Hundred Lovers are often written out of what seems like a very opposing idea, that instead of safety or identity in the past, they find terror and oppression in the past. And it's almost like the speaker is trying to reassure themselves, I'm still in the present, or there's sort of, this history is happening concurrently with their present.
No, I think that's right, Dylan. And I think part of growing up was realizing that my initial obsession, with the past and with what I thought was, in some sense, its more flexible masculinity, was wrong. Um, and that the things I loved, the things that gave me pleasure, um, would have also been places of exclusion and death. But it's a kind of childhood misreading. I thought I was from the wrong time, and as I've grown up, I think I've realized that I'm in the best possible time.
Wow. It reminds me of something Evan Boland said about her poetry, and I know you worked with her, and she passed away a couple of years ago, about she didn't begin to find her poetic voice until she realized that the history and the past were two different things. And I think I really saw that in these poems. There's several poems that I'm thinking of, and I'm going to maybe leave it up to you to choose, but I was thinking of Linen or September or Opulence, or you can read a
Yeah,
couple.
it's interesting. All of them do deal with this. Um, and I'm interested too, I think, in all of those poems about a somewhat ambiguous relationship with those histories. Because places where horrible things transpired can also be places of pleasure now and of new memories and of new experiences. And I'm very interested in that complex relationship, that you could be in a place, that every place really is a place abounding with wounds, and they both do and don't matter to our present selves. That really interests me. Um, Maybe I'll read September
Great.
because I don't think I've ever read it before. You know, when you have the book out and you're doing these readings, you fall into a bit of a rut reading the same poems. So it's good to spend time with another one. And this poem, September, I did also write in Evan Boland's workshop
Oh, wow.
too. So there's an Evan connection. A lot of these poems um, wouldn't have been possible without her mentorship and her um, very firm and interesting takes on what it was I was up to as a poet in this time period. September. The stores are closed, but the street is busy. All the bodies that move hide their dead lovers. The street name commemorates the month and day of independence, but not the year. A wall of portraits, a fist on the hilt of a sword, fingers on documents of learning and possession. In that kingdom, I'd be killed for passive love. We walk in the rain, the sea so seamless. We drink liquor in tall glasses without ice. The poem, I think about that ambiguity, you know, about belonging and not belonging to history, right? The stores are closed for some reason. Um, I think I'm thinking of some kind of unknown holiday, some saint's day, some feast day, that has this effect, but the speaker is alienated from it. Um, you know, there's all of these streets named after important days. Um, you know, something like July 4th or September 14th or something. But the year isn't given. There's a lot of ambiguity toward this history. And then those portraits, I mean, I'm thinking of those grand manner portraits, the kind of Pompeo Batoni style paintings of of these gentlemen. And I'm always thinking about their hands in those pictures, right? The fist, there's always like the masculine fist and then the feminine fingers, right? There's always kind of a tension between what is powerful and what is refined. So I had to mention the fist on the sword, but then the fingers on the documents of both learning and possession. That even learning, even erudition, is part of a complex set of relations of power.
I want to talk a little bit more about the voice. We've already touched on this a lot, but the voice is different from Second Empire. And it really seemed like it was part of that relationship to the past is what changed. I mean, there are certain details. There aren't jeans in the first book or black baseball hats or puppy masks. or Robert Mapplethorpe, but it's also how simply the lines end, right? That so many of them just end with a period or end with a comma. And I think a way of maybe talking about all of this is having you read Under Limestone, but go ahead if you want to respond to my reading there.
No, I love your reading. I mean, it was my goal to work to be more direct, to eschew ornamentation to the best of my ability, even as someone who loves ornament and who values ornament, to be more forceful, to be sharper than in the poems of the first book. I think very often being an artist is about learning what you're good at and then not doing it. That's a way you try to develop or discover other aspects of your voice. And that process was very deliberate here. Under limestone. It rained in fluted torrents. The earth smelled of manure. It was like desire entering and possessing you quietly. We undressed. The sun through the windows made shapes on the couch I lay face down on. Our jeans were soaked and wrinkled on the radiator, our socks heavy. Then your eyes were opening a little. Then you could hear the mopeds starting up again. When it was dry enough, we found a small bistro where we had Prosecco and fries and took pictures of one another in our damp clothes under trees and buildings of the hated regime.
So, Richie, this has to be a reference to Auden. It's sort of a Polaroid version of In Praise of Limestone. And I think just as concerned with making the body the historical actor, but also, I guess, letting the voice speak more comfortably. You know, I also like that ornament, right? That is my tendencies. I love, I wrote down from the first book the word austerer, which sounds like a very Auden word to me. And I love it. But, you know, I guess I thought of the speaker as being, is there a way that voice is responding to the time we're in now? Because I thought of the speaker being this kind of Auden character roaming Europe, fearing the rise of fascism.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. And I mean, people want to know where does a poem like this take place?
Right, right.
And I mean, the truth is, it kind of takes place everywhere. Um, the the it feels like everywhere I travel, there are buildings of some hated regime, including our own time. I wrote it in the midst of our own hated regime. Um, I think it was a rare rainy day in Portugal. Um, you know, that when I wrote this poem, but there's a way that it feels like these forces are always acting in tension with us. They they have profound effect on our lives. They come and go. We come and go. Elements of them linger and threaten and terrify. But a life also happens in the midst of it all. There are still relationships. There are still mopeds and prosecco and rainstorms. And all of this feels to me animated in the Auden poem too. Again, I think that poem, In Praise of Limestone, too, is just about is in some sense about how individuals exist or how an individual voice might exist in the kind of onslaught of time, historical, geological, and how we're shaped. Um, we're shaped and not shaped by those forces.
I have a couple poems in mind. I would love to hear the Marie Antoinette poem. It's one of my favorites.
It's another. I'm realizing how how ambivalent the speaker is toward history in all of these poems that we're talking about together. Again, just not something I quite consciously thought of until you make me think of it, Dylan. Um, Also, this is also kind of a marriage poem, or like a imminent marriage. It also has this long title, which is very rare for me, and which I'm generally opposed to in other people's poems, but I had to indulge myself. At the rustic hamlet built in 1783 for Marie Antoinette, last Queen of France. No tourists, water turning a mill wheel, serving nothing but artifice. I am a servant to order and erotic love, soon to be yours. You take a picture of me by a trellis, both of us failing at the vernacular style. In the temple of the god of love, a naked boy clutches an arrow. Once, in the manicured pasture, they reclined, holding shepherd's crooks, noble women who pretended to be someone else, their wigless hair tucked into washed linen, their dresses fastened with ribbons. Even now, the murdered queen and her reassembled effects making room for art. We throw out pieces of an unwanted batar, your gloved hand feeding the pond, the regal monogamous swan, the hungry whiskered fish you drop the bread on. As I read this, I can hear the gay little boy, um, obsessed with Versailles, in that kind of sumptuous description of the dresses. And really interestingly, I think he was probably pretending to be someone else, and so were these women. This kind of notion of these women pretending to be country people in the Queen's Hamlet, and the speaker, probably growing up pretending um, to be in part of some other time, and all of the violence kind of pushed to the side.
Right. This is
Um,
not the class critique that it might normally be when people talk about this rustic hamlet that Marie Antoinette had.
well, and now I mean, it's a tourist space. It's a kind of obligatory trip people take when they go to Paris. It's a day trip. You only have to do it once in your life, and you never want to go back. It's weirdly divorced from that from the violence of that history, as the women were, right. I'm one of my kind of private obsessions is just that people inside of history don't know what's coming next. It seems so neat and inevitable to us. I think the title Second Empire is interested in that, that where it's so easy to periodize, but the people at the Palais Garnier didn't know that everything was going to crumble, and neither did these country women.
Well, and neither do these
And now,
lovers.
no, and now lovers are here, soon to be married. A kind of crazy notion in a place like this, um, trying to make it, um, trying to serve one another, to serve their sense of order, to serve the other.
But also serve a sort of artifice, right? I mean, there's, um, the monogamous swan, but then there's a very alluring fish at the end with a mustache.
That's right. That's right. Um, yeah, and that's a danger here. Um, that's a danger. There's also that batar. It's kind of like their unwanted child that gets fed. The child that they won't have together. That gets fed to these dueling impulses. The kind of the regal swan, right? Is it the ghost of the queen herself somehow, who had a very unhappy marriage? And then I don't know, what are those hungry fish? They're kind of an ugliness. They kind of break the order. They're not meant to be seen. They're supposed to be suppressed below the surface, but they come up for the bread. And they take the bread that's meant for the swans, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of the let them eat cake, right? Those are kind of the peasant. Those are the kind of mouths of the peasants, breaking the serene and perfect surface of the Queen's Hamlet.
Yeah.
And I think the speaker is interested in those dueling impulses in him.
It's
Right?
yeah.
You can dress up. You can dress up as something, but that can't disguise you from yourself. Not for long.
Right. There's still the other 100 lovers. I would love to also hear you read the Fables, which I think follows what we've been discussing.
Mm. Is this interesting, Dylan?
I think it is. I'm fascinated. I'm riveted.
But the truth is, you read this book with so much more knowledge and insight than I have as the author.
I know, but that's how poetry goes. That's how every writer is.
It's true. It's true. And it's a strange thing to know about your own poems, because you know what you intended to make, but you also you have the memory of where you were and who you were when you made it. And so it's a kind of queer experience to relive that too, which is a kind of paratext to the art itself that no one else has knowledge of. The Fables. In school, we read a ridiculous story by Aesop, one not involving wise or foolish animals or insects, but one in which a god allocates emotions to the parts of the body, intellect to the mind, love to the heart, etc., etc., until only the asshole is left, to which the god assigns shame. Understandably, shame is unhappy with the accommodations, but it's too late. Shame curses. If Eros should ever seek to occupy that place, I will leave the body for good. This is why homosexuals have no shame, according to Aesop or one of his Victorian translators. According to me, this is why there is no moral order to my sexual imagination, and why praising my looks and hair and white flesh as I lie with you, then falling silent for days at a time, you really are the master of my pain.
I mean, Richie, the idea of there being no moral order to my sexual imagination, the speaker sees himself so frankly and speaks these desires so frankly. It's connecting me to an earlier thing you said about wanting to disappear in the poems and wanting to be annihilated by pleasure. There's sort of connected there for me. I'm thinking of other lines too. Every desire I had, I wanted enacted on the beaches and bathrooms and train stations. Or another poem says, I don't know how to explain my love of pleasure without sounding like a creep. But there's a kind of determined, quiet defiance here, or maybe a worry that it's not defiant enough sometimes to express the annihilation we want.
That's right. I mean, I don't know if I'm ever able to achieve it, but I think the speaker is constantly trying to convince himself of it. But in this poem too, I mean, it breaks down. In the fables, it breaks down because he's still subject to pain, and so the moral order reasserts itself somehow. Right? He ultimately feels entitled to I don't know, the full attention or the lasting attention, the constancy, the right, we inconstant ones.
Yeah, yeah,
There's
yeah.
Auden again. The constancy of the lover. So the moral order does reassert itself. I don't know, maybe he's more Victorian than he
Well,
wishes.
there's like a pleasure, right, at just having been able to say that at all, to having been able to say, well, according to me, even if it's pulled back later. Um, can we hear and talk about Bottom's Dream?
Yeah, certainly. A Shakespearean poem. Not an Arno Schmidt poem. Yeah. Um, I well, I've been interested in Midsummer Night's Dream for since I was a teenager, um, and I love both the Shakespeare play and the Benjamin Britten opera. You know, Britten is important to me, and there's that amazing bass bass aria, and there's a lot of bass voices in the book. And so I wanted to write a poem called Bottom's Dream, and I was thinking of all of the senses that Bottom talks about, and he's kind of mangling them in this kind of synesthetic phantasmagoria, right?
I have
You
the lines
know.
here, Richie. I'll read them.
Oh yeah. Would you read them? Would you read them? Yeah, I can't quote them from memory.
And then we'll lead into the poem because the first part of the poem mirrors this. The eye of man hath not heard, the ear of man hath not seen. Man's hand is not able to taste, his tongue to conceive, nor his heart to report what my dream was.
Yeah, that's absolutely the lines I was thinking of, and in thinking about kind of importing Shakespeare's Bottom into a contemporary kind of gay bottom milieu, I was thinking that so many spaces of gay interaction in particular, I mean, I think any kind of erotic interaction that's mediated by nightlife or something is actually meant to dull and mangle the senses, right? Where like those club environments are so abusive, in part because like they disguise us as much as possible. You can't see or hear or smell anything in spaces like that. So I was kind of interested in, I don't know, that's where I began.
Well, and just before you start, it's also like, just like with the fables, there's this sort of like, um, joke, and like Bottom says before that in Shakespeare, man is but an ass. There's like a joke on that, but then um, that the rest of that Bottom speech becomes this sort of supreme statement of the power of the imagination. And he says, I will get Peter Quince to write a ballad of this dream. It shall be called Bottom's Dream because it hath no bottom, and I will sing it.
Yeah, and the speaker of this poem, I think, gets to that place too, and then realizes he's being an
Well, let's hear it.
ass, realizes it's ridiculous. At least that's what I was thinking. I mean, one can get swept up in one's own romantic kind of powers, and I think that the poem is a bit about the dangers of that in both eros and in poetry. Bottom's Dream. The less he can see me, smell me, hear me, and taste me, the better. It's by design. Madonna playing, my shirt open. Another season entirely outside, where we spill out onto an almost winter street. I remember smoke drifting from his lips, making rococo shapes, his mouth sticky. the limestone walls, making us so hairy and dynamic by contrast. I think of those paintings kept behind a curtain in a perverted bishop's collection. Don't I know then? My death will be a thin fabric he kisses me through. Fuck. I shouldn't say that. I'm from New Jersey. My dad was an executive. My fantasies of violence are trite. Still, I thought it. Everything humid for a minute. The lindens shedding globby tears.
There's just so much in this. I mean, it's, first of all, many people say fuck in New Jersey. But
well, I don't think
I know
it's not fuck he shouldn't say. He shouldn't say my death will be a
right.
thin fabric this lover kisses me through. It's so ridiculous. It's I think he realizes that he's gotten in over his head a bit or been swept up in the I don't know, in this kind of sensual environment, and has to kind of reassert in some sense, I don't know, it's like the judgmental voice in the mind re-entering the poem and saying, no, you've gotten too far, you can't, this isn't Keats, this isn't Shakespeare, you're from New Jersey, and yet the thought persists in spite of that editorial judgmental impulse.
Yeah, I will sing it.
The Lind exactly. The lindens are still weeping, are still oozing. The smoke is still making these rococo patterns. Like the environment is charged, even if we become aware that I don't know that we're inventing the kind of power of the sense experience that we find ourselves totally swept up in.
I think there's a movement in the book towards a suggestion that frankness of voice, that's still asserting, even if there's that judgmental voice still saying, I will sing it, seems like it comes out of having one specific lover. And, at first, the book, and maybe this is part of the coldness too that I sensed and, both repelled and attracted me. You see the book 100 Lovers and you think, well, am I just going to be another 100 lover? I want to be special. And I was thinking again of Auden saying that, most readers believe in the double standard with writers. They can be unfaithful to him, but he must never be unfaithful to them, right? But there's also no dedication in this book. And I know the first book is dedicated to Ryan, and I just wondered how that all...
I didn't put any names in it. I didn't thank anyone in the acknowledgments either. I didn't, I thought part of my interest in this book was the kind of sense of anonymity, was the kind of fungibility of the him, of the he, of the man, of the boy, whoever it is, poem by poem. So I didn't feel comfortable putting any names in the erotic journal. Even in the apparatus of the book, I thought, let's kind of keep it nameless.
Yeah. Can we hear Pernod?
Oh yeah, this is the poem where the title comes from. Pernod. In the summer, I slept without a shirt. I dreamed light BDSM dreams. I walked through forests of tall black trees and maidenhair ferns. I guzzled Pernod. I took pictures of the carvings above the black columns of the local chapel. A man carrying a sheep, a miser being chastised. To give oneself to 100 lovers, hard. To give oneself to one, also hard. I watched an older man and a younger man tanning themselves by the freezing pool. I stayed up all night. I cleaned my genitals in the sink.
So I think one of the multiple meanings of that poem, the word hard can be read as difficult, right? It's difficult to give yourself to 100 lovers or to one lover, but it can also mean with force, right? Like a suggestion. Either way, give yourself over to it. And I think that's part of maybe the power of these poems as I might have these grand readings and you're always a little ambivalent about them because the power of them is actually resisting transcendence. There's the last line of the last poem is, if you've reached the tower, you've gone too far, or something like that, right? They totally resist
That's right.
transcendence. And I thought maybe that's also part of the obsession with the past. Like, we have a poem, there's a poem called Rilke Poem, there's an archaic torso on the cover, but this is not saying you have to change your life. It's saying you must follow your erotic self, maybe, because it's even as tumultuous it is, it's as safe as lasting as anything else, as all these arts. It's all collapsed into one thing.
That's really eloquent. Um, the other alternative that's presented too is what if there are no lovers, which is kind of how the poem
Right, right.
ends. It's a kind of poem of loneliness, I think. Um, you know, a kind of ritual loneliness of staying up. The freezing pool kind of sets that. And I'm thinking about temperature in the book too, and hotness and coldness, and the pool you can't swim in because it's freezing, and then the genitals being kind of ritually washed in the sink, and the kind of loneliness and eros of that gesture. Um, and this is, of course, where the title comes from. A lot of people, they wonder if the book will have 100 lovers in it, or if there'll be 100 poems, each about a different lover, or if the lovers will be ranked or something. But I think it's kind of just meant. It's meant as a kind of expression of multiplicity and possibility, and the challenge of that, the challenge of being anyone, of belonging to someone, even if it's for a moment, of being seen or known or naked or vulnerable. That challenge is persistent. That no intimacy really quite breaks the hardness of that.
And and I think by the end of the book, we as readers get that faithfulness. Maybe it's because of the openness that we can all read ourselves into it. Um, but we get to imagine that we're the ones being spoken to in French novel. And I thought we might end with French novel.
Yes. I put Pernod after
I know.
French novel because I wanted it to break. I wanted it to break the sweetness of that poem
Well,
a
let's
bit.
give our listeners the sweetness to end on for today
Yeah,
at
no, I
least.
always, it's funny, Dylan. I always end on this one because it's most people's favorite poem in the book. But when I did arrange the book, I wanted Pernod to come after. I wanted there to be that. My friend Will says there's a kind of like the pepper that gets stuck in your teeth that kind of alters the experience a bit. Um, but I'll read this poem. I mean, it's a very important poem to me. Um, it's a poem that took me many years to write. I was looking through old drafts and I found one of these lines, with boots we trekked through slush for a bottle of red wine we weren't allowed to buy, was in a draft from 12 years ago. Though that never became a poem. It's just one of the things. So it's a memory I'd wanted to write about for a long time. I just didn't have the way in. I didn't have the skills. French novel. You were my second lover. You had dark eyes and hair. like a painting of a man. We lay on our stomachs, reading books in your bed. I emailed my professor. I will be absent from French novel due to sickness. You put on some piano music. Even though it was winter, we had to keep the window open day and night. The room was so hot, the air so dry, it made our noses bleed. With boots, we trekked through slush for a bottle of red wine we weren't allowed to buy, our shirts unbuttoned under our winter coats. The French language distinguishes between the second of two and the second of many. Of course, we'd have other lovers. Snow fell in our hair. You were my second lover. Another way of saying this, you were the other, not another.
Is there anything else you want to say, Richie, or any other poem you want to read?
Mm, I could talk with you all day long. You helped me see this book, which, is now finally not mine. Um, is there another poem I should read for that you might do something with?
Um, we could hear Spring Wedding.
That's another Chicago poem. It has a lake in it. I guess one other thing I would say is that I think the book is very much interested in vows and disavowals. And I guess I see there being kind of two wedding vows in the book. One of them is the poem Spring Wedding, and the other is the poem Museum that has the line, I will abandon you, I will come back, which is in a way a kind of rewriting of the wedding vows in the book. But these are the real, this is the real wedding itself. Spring Wedding. The day before we married, we napped in the afternoon with no sheets over us and felt the breeze from the lake on our backs and butts and legs. It felt different, a small rebellion that we've slept in one another's arms for 10 years, like little beasts, vulnerable and hairy, with saliva on our skin. The next day, we were men again. Ironed shirts, knotted ties of silk, deodorant, parted hair, promises. We will have children. We will buy another house. One of us will get cancer. All of our parents will die.
It combines, I think, so many things that we've been talking about: the frankness, the desire to say what is unsaid.
Well, and it's part of the hardness of giving oneself to one person, as well as that, to commit to someone for life. You get the beautiful and the ugly. You're a part of all of the emotional experiences, both kind of luminous and triumphant, but also devastating. And I think that's what you're really signing up for at a wedding. We mostly are thinking of the joy, but I also knew, if this union is to last, it will last through probably the deaths of our parents. It's not something I think you typically think of, but it's something that I wanted to reflect on and think about. That's also part of the hardness or the force, the difficulty, all of those meanings of hard that come with giving oneself fully to anyone.
It, yeah, it's just I am amazed too at the placement of these different marriage poems and all these different lovers in between and during.
Yeah, well, the marriage doesn't have to end. It doesn't end
Exactly.
desire. It doesn't. I mean, it's supposed to, I suppose.
Not in a
But
Richie Hofmann book.
no, but it doesn't. I don't think it does in most people's lives. Um, and I'm interested in where that can take someone, artistically and erotically and geographically too, to other times and other places.
No, well, I mean, I really want to know, like, how does this voice age?
Well, me too. I know like personally what my artistic goals are going forward, and that's to not do this again. I can't write a diaristic kind of book. I was striving for the directness. I was striving for the clarity. I was striving for the kind of intimacy of speaking to oneself, as if it were a diary. I wanted the poems to feel kind of dashed off, even as they kind of chisel their way into the world. And I know that going forward, I can't do that anymore. And so everything I've written since has been pushing past that. Right now, everything has to be 2 pages long. I can't settle on this shape anymore. And I feel Dylan where where the Hundred Lovers poem would have ended. And that's always my signal that I need to keep pushing beyond that ending because you have to challenge yourself.
Yeah. I mean, my joke was that these are like aging twink poems.
Well, I identify as a washed up twink, so yeah, um, that's right. But like, I do think these are poems of desire of one's prime. I mean, they're not teenage poems that are kind of filled with longing. I think Second Empire is much more teenaged. I think I was so scared of never being loved or of losing what little love I felt I could accomplish in this life. Oh, I wanted in Second Empire to, I wanted so badly to make permanent anything of love, and any violation, any infraction, any transgression seek to threaten the whole project of the history of desire. And it was such a thing of fear. Um, these are written on the other side of marriage, on the other side of erotic turmoil and erotic oblivion. And I think one of my interests in this book is to capture that. But they're not. I can't be Cavafy. They're not looking back at one's youth or when one felt sexually desirable or when one had access to a world of pleasure that now feels faded or distant. Um, but they're not. I don't feel like they're juvenile in their desires. I wanted them to be as sober, and true to me as possible, and to not lie, and to not exaggerate, and to not overinflate, and to not undercut everything I was feeling, as a husband and as a lover and as a poet and as a man. But I was really interested in getting at an uglier side of myself in these poems.
Right.
Like, I didn't want them to be culturally exemplary or didactic or to feel like I was speaking for a queer identity. Like, I wanted them to be ungenerous. Like, the speaker is like not he's not a liberated person. I mean, I think he's highly judgmental, he's prissy, he's bourgeois. Like, I think like he's kind of disgusted by other people's bodies and emotions at times. He's a bit selfish in his pursuit of pleasure at times, or of his treatment of his own husband, at times. But like, I was kind of interested in I don't know, making a space where I could write poems that fleshed out, that literally kind of fleshed out all sides of myself, even things that were uglier or franker or stranger or more ungenerous. What lingers is a kind of desire to be sensuous, to be intimate. I mean, that's what I crave. And it's what more and more I crave from poetry, Dylan, is sensuousness. Um, I want to read details that feel like a world of feeling is inside of them. That's what I want from poetry, and that's the poetry I'm really striving to make in 100 Lovers.
You can find 100 Lovers by Richie Hofmann here at the library in our podcast collection, or find out more about Richie Hofmann on his website, richiehoffmann.com. That's our show. Thank you to Richie for taking the time to talk with us, and thank you for listening to our 52nd interview episode and the start of our 6th year of the show. Comments and feedback are always welcome and can be sent to podcast@deerfieldlibrary.org. Go to deerfieldlibrary.org/podcast to learn more about our show and find links to subscribe. You can also follow the library on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, or check out our YouTube channel. Links are on our website or in our show notes. We'll be back next month. Thanks for listening.